This podcast is solely for the attention of institutional, professional, qualified, or sophisticated investors and distributors.
Hi everyone, today we are going to talk about the impact of climate change on inflation. This is very timely for two reasons. First, because inflation has accelerated very strongly in the US and in Europe, partly because of energy prices. And second, because more and more central banks, whose primary mandate is almost always price stability, have announced that they want to take action against climate change. ECB, for example, has presented an action plan in July to include climate change considerations in its monetary policy strategy. This action plan contains several items. One could cite the requirement for private sector assets which are purchased by the ECB or which are taken as collateral in the refinancing operations, the disclosure of information related to greenhouse gases emissions, or the disclosure of risks associated with climate change. One could also cite the inclusion of climate-related criteria from 2023 in the Corporate Bond Purchase Program, the CSPP, with a likely overweighting of green securities. As we can see in the case of the ECB, the actions of central banks to fight climate change are increasingly concrete, but what do we know about the impact of climate change on inflation in the medium term? At the moment, the economic literature on the subject is rather limited. It is generally accepted that there are three channels through which climate change can disrupt the price stability mandate of central banks. First, climate change is associated with an increase in the frequency of climate disasters, which can affect certain prices specifically, such as food prices. Second, the energy transition can induce, at least for some time, an increase in the price of carbon, which can be transmitted to consumer prices through an increase in the price of electricity, gas, gasoline, or producer prices. And third, higher temperatures on average can weigh on activity and reduce labor productivity, which can reduce growth potential. So, what do we know about the different channels from an empirical point of view? For the first channel, that of climate disaster, we can already mention the fact that for the 10 biggest climate disasters of 2021, they cost $170 billion, that is to say about 20 billion more than in 2020. And with regard to the impact on inflation, an ECB working paper published in 2016 and working on 212 countries showed that natural disasters in general had a relatively limited impact on inflation in developed countries, but more substantial and more persistent for developed countries, and this is particularly strong for food prices. For the second channel, which concerns the energy transition, this is by construction very difficult to present empirical findings on long databases because it is only beginning. On the other hand, we can already feel tensions on the price of fossil fuels and on the price of certain metals, something already discussed during the podcast number 23 of this series. Also, what ECB stressed in the preparatory work of its strategic review is that the impact on the energy transition on inflation will really depend on whether this transition is orderly or disorderly. Finally, for the third channel, which concerns the effect of global warming itself on inflation, an ECB working paper has just been published and sought to determine the medium-term impact of extreme temperatures on inflation. The authors worked on a 30-year database covering a group of 48 countries, and they conclude that hotter than average summers lead to higher food prices in the short term, whether in developed or emerging countries. In contrast, they establish a negative impact on inflation over the medium term, possibly due to a negative impact on the demand. In addition, they show that the impact on prices in the medium term is non-linear. When the temperature shocks are very important or when they are materialized in already hot countries, the impact on inflation in the medium term is much stronger. In short, what emerges from all this is that this is increasingly clear that climate change is disrupting the economy, but also inflation, and that central banks, whether they like it or not, and we can see, for example, that the Fed is a little behind on the subject, will be forced to tackle the subject head-on. And very clearly, climate change is not something that we can no longer afford to overlook in the economic analysis. Thank you, and talk to you soon.
All comments and analysis reflect CPR AM views on market conditions and its evolution, according to information known at the time. As a result of the simplified nature of the information contained in this document, That information is necessarily partial and incomplete.